everybody. Today we're going to look at compressors and compression and what they are, how to use them. So take a listen to this marimba track here and I'll show you what we're going to do with the compressor here and how it works. And it continues on kind of in that manner. And especially if we look at the piano roll, we notice that certain notes are really loud. So especially these, every time the chord changes, these first notes are really loud, and this is just an example. It's not always used on a MIDI instrument, but it gives the idea. Compressors are going to be probably more useful on an audio track rather than a MIDI track, because we can go in and change those if we want. But this will work for our purposes. So a compressor basically is going to take the parts of the track that are really loud and bring them down. So this is going to make it more smooth and more easy to listen to and more pleasing to the ear. We don't want really sudden bursts of loud noise because people listening to our tracks don't want to have that surprise, and it will be jarring and kind of ruin the feel of it. So a compressor is what's used to help kind of compress everything and make it sound better and sound more even. So to use this in Logic Pro, we'll go ahead and open it up. And here we have, it looks really intimidating. There's lots of knobs and lots of buttons, but we'll look at what all of these things do. Everything up here is at the top. You can see it has all its presets and all different types of things to mix drums. I often prefer to create my own so that it's unique to whatever I'm using. We'll look at sidechain in another video, but that is very useful when mixing lots of stuff, especially when you're mixing vocals with other instruments and other different types of tracks. So we'll look at that in a second. Also here we have all these different types of compressors, VCA, FET, Opto, and again we'll look at those in a different video, and I'll explain what each of like digital VCA, FET, all those things mean and what the advantages and disadvantages are. But for this video, we're just going to stick on the stuff that's right down here. So right here on the far left, we have the input gain. This is just how much are we going to boost the input as it comes in. I often leave it alone. I actually often leave both input and output alone, just for the reason of I like to have all of my volume controls kind of in one area. So if I have a track and my volume, I can't get my slider up enough to have it enough, I'll just add a gain plugin either at the end or the beginning of the signal chain in the list of plugins, because I don't really want to have a whole bunch of different gain adjustments and a whole bunch of different plugins, because then it's just really hard to go in and change them and fix them and get them to where you need. So if we listen to this, this is just the default settings right now. We can see this little needle coming down, and that is showing how much it is compressing, so how much volume it is pulling off of the track. So you can see it was going between -5 and -10 dB. If we pull it over to the graph, which is the one that I like a little more, and play it again, we can see all the audio, and then this little white line is what shows how much compression was being done. We can see there was a little bit done on each. So let's take a look at each of these little things. We talked about input gain, but threshold. So this is basically the point where compression is going to start. And I like this graph because you can see this little kind of triangle shape, and this is an important thing to look at. You'll see this on most compressors, and we'll talk about how it works in a second. The threshold is basically at what point are we going to say, okay, we need to start compressing the signal, or at what point is it going to get too loud? And this is all going to vary based on the track and what kind of mix you have. So for us, we'll set it about 20, just a little more than 20. And now the ratio. So this is how strong the compression is. So you can see it's in the form of a ratio. So right now it's 2.1 to 1. So that means it's going to reduce the audio as it goes past the threshold about twofold. So you can see the bigger we make it, the much more compression we're going to have. And if we have it down at 1 to 1, that's no compression. It's not changing the audio any. Generally in the range from like 1.5 to 3 is about good, but if you need something more severe, you can really go up to probably about 10. But once you're getting past that, you're getting into some really, really strong compression. And at that point, you might want to look at other stuff for changing your track. So as you see, as we've been adjusting these knobs over here on this triangle, things have been changing. So you can see with the ratio, as we pull it up, this area gets much more flat. So you can see this is a curve, and we have these decibel markings. So as it goes up, we can see down here is the strength of the input. So let's say we have an input at -30, and this over here on the y-axis is the output. As you can see, it's about 30 because our threshold's at -15, so any input at -30 is not going to have crossed that threshold. But if we're going up to closer to -20, -15, you can see that's where compression starts. So if we had an input of -10 dB, the actual output would be probably closer to around 17, -17. So we can see that's kind of how the compression is working. It's just squishing it all down so it is much more pleasing to hear. And we'll go down here, and this is the knee. So the knee refers to the point where the threshold is crossed and where the original audio starts coming into the compressed audio. So if we have a really small number, we have a hard knee. So we can see that is a really specific point right there. And if I turn the ratio up, you can see it even more. But that's a really hard point where it's uncompressed and then it suddenly becomes compressed. So we generally don't want a hard knee as much. Leaving it around 0.5 or anywhere from 1 to 0.5 is better because it's going to kick in much slower. And that's generally what we want. The purpose of the compressor is to make sure all the changes in the audio are very subtle and smooth. We don't want sudden changes in the audio. The attack is just how quickly the compressor is going to kick in. Once it passes that, leaving it anywhere from 0 to 120 is generally good. After getting that, it's going to be much smoother, but you're going to get more of those loud sounds coming through. So I generally leave it somewhere in the middle here. As always with most stuff, the smaller you go, there's probably going to be bigger changes and maybe some weird sonic artifacts in there. And the release is basically how quickly the compressor is going to turn off. So the longer it is, the greater the possibility is that there's going to be sounds that aren't actually above the threshold still being compressed. So that can end up with some weird kind of fluctuations in the sound, which is why generally leaving it anywhere from 20 to 500 is good. You don't want it to turn off too quickly because if we had it really low, then there's going to be definitely some really weird sounds going on because it's going to be tripping on and off really quickly. So leaving it, I generally like it on the higher side just so it sounds good. So that's just how quickly the compressor is going to turn off. Auto setting is just going to set some of these parameters automatically. I often don't like it as much because I like to be able to go in and fine tune all the things very specifically. And now makeup here. So while it actually sounds kind of like the compressor is making your audio louder, it is in actuality making it softer. So makeup is just to kind of boost it up again. You can see the whole triangle over here moving up and down, just to kind of boost it up and get it back to where it was before it came into the compressor. So I'll often change this ever so slightly just so that the input strength is about the same as the output strength, so that the compressor really didn't change the actual volume of the audio too much, just so that it kind of flattened everything out and made it much nicer. Over here we have our output gain over here. Again, I don't change this that often because I don't like to make too many gain adjustments in too many plugins, because then it can be really hard to go back in and track down and try and find where anything that sounds weird is happening, and I often like to just do it at the end or the beginning just so I have it in one spot. The mix here is just if you want to mix some uncompressed audio with the compressed audio. So if you did all input, then that is basically completely bypassing the compressor because you're mixing completely of the input signal. So it's just going straight through. If you had all output, then it's all output gain. Sometimes I will pull this down a little bit, especially if the compressor is being really finicky and really pulling a lot of those loud sounds down, because sometimes we do want a little bit of that punch, especially in instruments such as bass and kick drum, upright bass especially, where you want some of that really loud sound. So sometimes I'll change this, but most of the time I'm going to leave it at 100% of the output. Distortion, this is just more of an artistic thing. If you want it to kind of have a different feel to it, if you want to change how it sounds, you can make it so that it'll change, and this applies up here to the limiter as well. And we'll look at limiters again, but a limiter is basically a different type of compressor that is a very hard with a ratio of like infinity to 1. So it is not going to let the audio signal pass a certain level under any circumstances. So it's just kind of has that hard stop, and limiters can be useful, applied sometimes after compressors if the compressor is not taking everything out, but also if you just kind of want it to have a certain feel. I'll often leave this off, and if I want to apply a limiter later, I'll do that in a separate plugin. And then here we have the sidechain here, and we talked about that in a different video, and you can look at that, how to use a sidechain, which is very useful when mixing vocals with bands and stuff. And we talk about all of this as well, and the frequencies and everything else that does with sidechain compression. Let's say it correctly. So if we take a listen to this again and watch the graph. So we can see it's really nicely just taking off those tiny bits of the top of the loudest ones. And again, this is not something that we'd use really on a MIDI instrument that much, especially with this severe a change in the dynamics, because it would make more sense for us just to go in onto the piano roll and then change all of the things so they're not quite as loud. But this is something used more in live sound and with real audio, so that we can kind of just control it and make it so that it sounds much more clean. And that's the goal of a compressor, is to make it no real big changes in the level of the sound. We don't want people to have to be adjusting their volume of their headphones or of their speakers all the time because of changes in the signal strength and of the volume of the audio. So the compressor is one way that we can kind of help control that and reduce some of these really loud sounds that might get through and that might be kind of surprising or jarring to the listener. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and as always, have a wonderful day.